So hello everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Indigenous Peoples, Colonialism and Climate Justice with Professor Deborah McGregor of York University. My name is Megan Reid and I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Zorin Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This is the third webinar of this series, which is centered around the subject of climate change and its relationship to human rights. You can access the recordings of past series and sessions on our website, and my colleague Allison will be sharing the link to this in the chat box for you. In addition to today's highly anticipated session, we do have two exciting webinars left in this series. A webinar on the role of human rights, citizen suits, and domestic courts in limiting dangerous climate change taking place next Tuesday. And our final session happening on March 23rd on changing geopolitical borders and the future in the face of climate change. So we look forward to seeing you at those upcoming sessions as well. A few housekeeping items before I give our host a proper introduction. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box, or we also encourage you to use the raise your hand function, and then I will go in and unmute you so you can ask your question out loud and interact with our speaker today. The Q&A session will be 20 to 30 minutes at the end of today's presentation to address some of these questions. And if you have any specific questions for the Institute, we'll ask that you put them in the chat box or send us an email at admin@genocidestudies.org. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Professor Deborah McGregor. Professor McGregor is an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Toronto and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. Her research has focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental and climate justice, and health. Professor McGregor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to conversations. I will be drinking my tea from time to time since I've been talking a lot today in various meetings, and I don't want to start croaking and squeaking at people. So when that starts to happen, I will take a drink. So what I wanted to do today was make some of the links between genocide, some of the major commissions and inquiries that have come out recently in relation to Indigenous peoples. I'm speaking a lot in terms of my own work in the Canadian context, although I do refer to a bit of the international, linking also Indigenous rights to the conversation as well through UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Some of my own research, sort of where some of these questions are taking me as I respond to the needs and also aspirations and concerns of Indigenous people. So a lot of my work is very grounded in what I'm being told and being asked to do by First Nations. So I tend to focus a lot on First Nations context. So I serve on the Assembly of First Nations Climate Change Advisory Committee, and I work with often the Chiefs of Ontario. They represent 133 First Nations in Ontario. So I'm very familiar with what people's on the ground kind of concerns are and how they're understanding and experiencing climate change and people's solutions to climate change and assessments. But also the academic realm allows me to reach out or access other forms of knowledge that often they don't have access to because there's paywalls in universities to be able to access knowledge and literature. And then I also, then I'm in what I call these climate change circles. On the Adaptation Advisory Committee for Climate Choices, the Institute on Climate Choices, or Solutions. They keep changing their name. I think we're focused on solutions, and they engage in research, usually with the existing literature. And so in a lot of these circles, and then in another week or so, I think I'm on a panel for the Climate Science 250 approach that the federal government is taking on a climate assessment and how they're trying to cope with, I guess, for the lack of a better word, with Indigenous peoples within that. So I'm in these. So I call them in these other circles, and there's some experiences that have come out of that think we still have a very long way to go in terms of hopefully kind of moving in the right direction, particularly in relation to human rights, Indigenous rights, gender, and other forms of inequality and injustice. So I'll reflect on those as I go, because they tend to be top of mind and they're coming up. I haven't disengaged from those. I'm still in these spaces where a lot of the times I'm kind of frustrated in terms of trying to continually explain how, genocide is connected to climate justice and how that should be forming part of policy and it needs to be recognized in there. So I'll reflect on those kind of experiences as I go along, and then happy to engage with folks as well afterwards. So I did try to structure this, and so is thematic to this speaker series, but there's a lot of other places to kind of go with this. So hopefully, hopefully we can have some interesting and engaging. I'm also looking forward to learning from you, because you'll know lots of things that I haven't been exposed to because I'm so focused in the world that I'm in, that I also recognize there's a lot going out there as well. So I am going to share a screen, and it worked 10 minutes ago. So hopefully it will work again. I am hoping to speak for roughly 35 to 40 minutes. Hopefully I achieve that. And then there's plenty of time for discussion. So Megan, you just give me the thumbs up if you're able to see this, because literally I gave a presentation once and no one could see the PowerPoint, even though it worked 10 minutes before. People just saw me waving my hands around, referring to pictures, until someone said, we're not seeing anything, because it wouldn't turn, like it wouldn't flip.
Oh no, yep, it looks good. Oh, look.
Before 15 minutes into it, that no one's actually seeing what I'm seeing. So so I will start. Now, I always start from this premise, and it becomes relevant later on in my discussion or in my presentation, is that Indigenous peoples have been on Turtle Island for thousands of years. So we had our own laws, we had our own governance systems, we interacted with each other as nations and had our own diplomatic traditions, our own treaties. And that's really actually most of our history. A lot of times I find in scholarship, somehow history only started at colonization or when newcomers arrived, and it's actually no, really most of Indigenous people's history is long before that. But it also means we were complete societies. We weren't just populations and subjects for other people to study, which is often, unfortunately, a lot of what the climate change literature looks like. It doesn't really engage with Indigenous peoples as societies, complete societies, because that's really actually mostly who we are. Colonization has been more recent for some folks. It's still long, right, from human point of view, a couple of centuries, but compared to the thousands of years that we were here, it's not. So it's important to understand Indigenous peoples as societies, not just populations that are just, you can just lump into the often you'll see the categories of vulnerable and marginalized people, including Indigenous people and others, right? Like we're actually societies, and just like Canada has a society and such. So to me, that's an important way to understand Indigenous peoples. And we had our own ways of how we were going to relate to the natural world. Also in our stories, we also dealt with major catastrophic change. And usually in our stories, and I don't have time to get into some of the stories and other presentations I do, is what I call climate change stories, is usually it's because humans were not behaving properly in relation to the natural world. And then there's usually a destruction that intends plans, and then there's a regeneration, a recreation process that happens. So we've had to confront in this thousands of years history, major dramatic change in our lives. And we have processes for how we go about trying to do that. So I did want to mention that. That's an important place to start in relation to thinking about how to engage with Indigenous peoples' knowledge, laws, governance structures as well. So a lot of you are going to know this. Things are not looking good for the planet. So I refer to these as the disaster reports. It's not looking good. I'm not going to read this. Many of you are going to be familiar with the IPCC 2021 report that we've kind of hit that point where maybe some changes are irreversible. All the other reports before were just like, oh my God, things are really bad, and if we don't change, it's going to get worse. We've kind of hit that point, and I think many of us are familiar with what we saw in terms of forest fires, in terms of flooding, in terms of other kind of major events that are indicating that, this it is code red and planetary health is being severely impacted. This is just more of, again, the disaster reports that are pointing to human nature relationships are not good, and that we need to change. Now, what I found the IPCC reports and others do, World Water reports, World Water Day is going to be in a couple of weeks, the IPBES report from the United Nations, is that they call for transformative change. They're business as usual, tweaking of the business as usual is not going to get us where we need to go. There needs to be massive transformative change. That's also what they're calling for, and that hasn't happened. And so one of the ways that I kind of look at this in some of my writing is whatever kind of knowledge and laws and governance that we're currently working with is not working, because things are actually getting worse. So it's not working. Like trying to do more of the same or intensifying more of the same isn't working. So we need to do things differently. And that's known, calling for transformative change. And what does that look like? And that's a little bit of what I'm interested in terms of the research that I'm doing. What does transformative change look like? Because that's what we need to do. We already know things aren't good, and whatever it is that we're doing isn't changing that. So we need to look at what that transformative change looks like. So that's sort of been a focus of the disaster reports that I've been paying attention to in more recent years. So this is drawing on Indigenous environmental sustainable development, climate change declaration. So one of the things I do in my scholarship is I'm an Anishinaabe person for my River First Nation. Right now I'm like talking to you on my computer in Toronto, but if I were at home, now I have to teach in person, so I can't be at home right now, 5 hours northwest of Toronto, I would be in my community, and I can't really say I represent all Indigenous perspectives, right? Like, very aware of that. But one of the ways that I try to engage with, where are there commonalities with, like, where can we draw strands together in terms of how we think? And that's through the International Indigenous Environmental Declaration. So I'm always paying attention to those. And a lot of what we see playing out was being called by Indigenous peoples since, one of the first ones to come out with the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. So at all these different meetings, Indigenous peoples would have these declarations. And these are just sort of excerpts from those, where people are critiquing, like I said, the status quo or tweaking of the status quo or the business as usual isn't working, regardless of how people might want to greenwash that. So this is being called by First Nations or Indigenous peoples for a long time. At Kimberley, with the World Sustainable Development Conference 10 years after the Earth Summit they said there's a climate crisis. No one was really calling it a climate crisis then. That was probably one of the first places I've seen it internationally. So I do draw upon that to sort of get that sense of what are Indigenous peoples experiencing around the world, that I could say with any level of confidence that we're kind of agreeing on that. And so the other part of their narrative is they always recognize colonialism as part of that. In a lot of these, again, climate change circles that I talked about, people don't like to go there. They don't like that. I call it the C word, right? Like, they like to talk about the other C words like carbon, but they don't know, what does that have to do with anything? But that was always very clear in the Indigenous narratives for decades in the international forum. So I'm always looking there to kind of see, particularly after the COP meetings, Conference of the Parties meeting on climate change, to see sort of what's being generated in terms of Indigenous perspectives and the kind of advocacy that they have to do in these kind of spaces. So the Canadian context. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation report that came out in 2015, that basically, this was controversial. This wasn't necessarily something that people embraced. Lots of, interviews around this that basically said, colonial and then later Canadian government policy practices, laws, and approaches to Indigenous peoples attacking their societies and people was a form of cultural genocide. And so that's part of the context of talking about climate change in Canada. And so that report was very clear about that. I'm no doubt there's a lot of people who don't accept that. And what you see also a picture of the residential school that my mother went to. So my grandmother she's since passed away, but she was a residential school survivor, as is my mother, who still is still alive. So it's also very much in my own family and history. And what that means is that in my mother's context, although she retained her language, she didn't teach it to us. So I'm like that generation that's lost that lost language. And language we now know, or there's growing international literature. People know this on the ground level in Indigenous communities, is that language is really key also to sustainability, which I'll talk about later. So that's a huge loss, and that's a direct result of cultural genocide. This report came out 2019. Again, most of you are probably familiar. Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women and Girls. National Inquiry, again, pointed to cultural genocide and actually had whole reports on genocide, particularly attacking women and non-binary gender fluid peoples. So this is what's part of what Canada is, and none of this has gone away. A lot of those same laws and policies and practices still exist. This isn't in the past, it's still now playing out in people's lives. And again, you know, struggle with how do you connect this to climate change. So to me, I view this as very much the context for climate change, for climate justice, and the work that I do. This is just one of the main findings from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So gaining control over lands and resources from Indigenous peoples. I'm pretty sure many of you would know that that's still a struggle for Indigenous people, hence sort of like the land back movement. But this has huge implications for what, again, people are considering to be the solutions, let's say nature-based solutions. Conservation areas, well, that's Indigenous lands. And so these solutions are being employed or I guess deployed on Indigenous lands when there's still these policies of trying to gain control over lands and resources. And Indigenous peoples look at this and think, we're not sure if we're cool with these solutions, because it means, like, do we no longer have access and govern and manage and like our own lands anymore? So this is one of those kind of tensions that exists, and like the solution everyone's excited about, including me when I first, nature-based solutions, that's great. But then when you get into it, you're just like, oh no, this might be, you know, someone else's solution that's actually not a solution in an Indigenous context. So this is just Kyle White, amazing scholar, Anishinaabe Potawatomi from the United States. So he again identifies colonialism as climate injustice. You have to name it. It's part of the conversation, just like genocide is. And the Mandela Declaration, this was Indigenous women's gathering on climate change. And again, they were calling for a lot of this and how climate change has undermined basically Indigenous way of life. It's not, climate change is not experienced in silos in an Indigenous context. And I'll explain why that's such a huge issue in terms of how research takes place, how solutions are devised. It's very siloed, but that's not how people experience it. So climate change and colonialism. So interestingly, probably not a surprise to you, is that the structural inequalities in Canada that exist through these laws and policies and structures render disproportional impacts on Indigenous peoples, and also the ability to be able to adapt and be resilient to them. So for example, the Indian Act confines people to a reserve context. Provinces through the British North American Act and a Constitution Act means that the provinces have control over lands and resources when that's also treaty area where Indigenous peoples want to assert authority, jurisdiction, and control. So there's these processes that are in place that are historical, that continue to play out, that limit how Indigenous peoples can respond to climate change. So these are just assumptions that are not going to be new to you. Indigenous peoples are vulnerable to climate change, but Indigenous communities have always adapted and survived. I describe these as sort of tensions. So on the one hand, Indigenous peoples are more marginalized or more impacted by climate change, often because of what you have when you look at well-being indexes in Canada. So they have one actually on the, I think it's Indigenous Services website, based on the World Health Organization, Indigenous peoples fall way behind on every indicator of wellness in Canada to the Canadian population. So these social, cultural, political determinants of health. So you're already in this sort of vulnerable position due to these colonial processes. So your capacity to be able to adapt and be resilient is compromised. But at the same time, Indigenous peoples have also adapted and survived despite genocide. So here we are, like I'm able to talk to you and say, I'm an Anishinaabe, part of the Anishinaabe Nation, when John A. Macdonald's explicit policy, when he became Prime Minister, you know, in 1867 was every single Indian in Canada is going to disappear. Like that was the policy. And we didn't have to worry about land claims or any of that, or Indigenous people, because they would be all gone. That didn't happen. So Indigenous peoples have managed to survive and adapt. There's something for other people to learn from that, despite, you know, this genocidal history. So there's always like this, you know, how we frame, I guess, climate justice in relation to Indigenous peoples and likely others. I think I already talked about that. Again, this is more from, oh, I'm going the wrong way. That's the problem. He calls it Indigenous realities deja vu. So this is again borrowed from Kyle White. Indigenous peoples have seen this before. Because what, and this is actually drives me crazy in a lot of these climate change circles that I'm in, and even some of the literature that I read, and when I'm doing a peer review and in a lot of these conversations, is Indigenous peoples experience climate change, the continuation of the environmental change brought on by colonialism and capitalism and other forces. And what happens in the climate change world is they don't like that. That's environmental change. This is climate change over here. People are confused. They're confusing environmental change with climate change because they don't understand like the reality that Indigenous peoples have in relation to their relationship to the land and this colonial and genocidal history. So that's how people experience it, and that's how people understand it. But that's not how the scholarship and how assessments work, like in terms of how do we know exactly what's going on in relation to climate change. So that kind of reality isn't well, I hate using this word, it sounds so horrible, captured. It isn't really, it's not really reflected in a meaningful way, I find, in a lot of the assessment work that I'm involved in. Indigenous peoples also recognize the impact on the non-human relatives and teachers. So a lot of our worldview goes beyond the human dimension, our relatives and teachers, water, forest, plants, bees, and they're considered also part of our community and how they're impacted. So people have seen this before in terms of, again, we also had stories that spoke to this as well, and instructions for what we need to do in order to survive into the future. Climate change impacts. I think here I wanted to, this you are already familiar with, but Indigenous people are impacted differently because of this close relationship to the land, because of these existing, for lack of a better word, vulnerabilities due to this colonial history, the health of Indigenous peoples, access to, you know, to those aspects like clean drinking water, which a lot of people take for granted. That's not so in a lot of Indigenous communities, food security. So Indigenous peoples are also impacted differently, as opposed to the same as everybody else, but more intense. I wanted to mention this because again, in our worldview, it isn't like we're looking at the impact on people because of this, the nature of the relationship to the land or to the earth itself. It's also looking at climate change is impacting the land in and of itself in terms of its own agency. So this is just a piece from Laurie Lambert, Indigenous scholar, who wrote a piece on Indigenous research for Indigenous survival. So we're also thinking of the non-human world in terms of our realm of climate justice, and where genocide also takes place in terms of communities. So a lot of our efforts are also in terms of how do we then heal wounded lands and waters. So this connection is really important in terms of how we think. And this is just images. So when this wounding is happening and people are trying to address it, and you're not part of climate policy circles, or you're not meaningfully involved in how people are generating what the solutions are, then when you're outside of those kind of processes and you're linking in, then you have to engage in other kind of activities or engage in these kind of processes in different ways. So people might call that protests. The language has changed a bit to say land defenders, water defenders. So when you're on the outside looking in, you have to do advocacy and work in different ways. And that's often the position that Indigenous peoples are in, because again, these larger legal political processes aren't working for Indigenous people. I'm just going to check that, make sure I'm not running out of time. Oh, no, I think I'm still good. Okay. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my climate change research. So a little bit is sort of leading into this. I'm working with Indigenous climate action in terms of what Indigenous-led climate policy might look like, because they did an analysis of the current policy, climate change policy framework in Canada. So the Pan-Canadian framework, the HEHE report, the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy report, and there really wasn't Indigenous, meaningful Indigenous engagement in them. And despite mentioning Indigenous people all the time. So again, Indigenous peoples are being excluded from these processes in a meaningful way. But rather than just stopping there, it's just saying, what would an Indigenous-led climate policy framework look like for Indigenous communities themselves? This then becomes related to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. What does a self-determined Indigenous climate policy framework approach look like? A lot of the times, Indigenous communities, including myself in these spaces, we're spending a lot of time and a lot of energy into reacting to other people's ideas all the time. And it's really hard to, share your perspective in these spaces, largely because people already have predetermined ideas about what that should be. But really, what does it look like for us? In Canada, there's very little Indigenous-led processes. In the province of BC, the First Nations there are starting to try to develop a policy framework around that. The National First Nations Health Authority there has funding, not a lot, to First Nations who want to sort of develop their own processes. There actually isn't a lot of support for First Nations to develop their own self-determined processes. What there is funding for is for us to participate in others, which is important. We definitely want to influence that. That's what I hear from leadership all the time. But that's not all we want to be doing. We want to be focusing on what do our communities need? What are their goals and aspirations? What does our own self-determined sort of approach look like into this? That's not, I wouldn't say that's a big part of the climate change radar in any of the circles that I'm in. I'm not gonna read this, but this was interesting. This came out of Carbon Brief, and so climate science excludes Indigenous peoples, except when we're the subjects of people's studies, and that's not the same as setting out what the research questions are, what the approaches are going to be. Climate Brief talked about the 1,000 most influential climate scientists. Only 122 are women, and none were identified as Indigenous, and it's really focused on the global north and tends to be men. So there's real, it's very biased. And I find that when I'm involved in climate assessments, and recently there was a report that I contributed to, and I had to do the risk and vulnerability for Indigenous people in North America, and they gave me 400 words to do it. And it was very constrained. I had to only refer to peer-reviewed literature of the last 5 years. And so you're not gonna have very much from Indigenous scholars because there's so few of us. They had a hard time tracking me down, and it was very last minute. A lot of the report was already done, and I was given maybe a month to do this when other people had years to prepare theirs. And there had to be certain things in the title. It had to be traditional knowledge, climate change, risk, Indigenous people. I go, nobody was asking these questions. If we were not caring about this or asking these questions 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we don't have that body of knowledge right now. It was so hard to do it, and I was so constrained by the literature and trying to show how colonialism and genocide should be part of this kind of assessment. Was really hard to do if you didn't have those in the titles, and the reason they had to be like that when people are looking at the peer-reviewed reference list, because that's what's valued above all else in the academic world, is they said nation states won't take it seriously. Like because these assessments are then used to try to influence nation states to adopt policies and processes and laws in response to the assessments. But the assessments are flawed because they're missing so much information, as Climate Brief's data showed, and also in my own experience. That's what I've been finding. That body of knowledge doesn't exist. There is a bit on research on Indigenous people, but not with and collaborative with Indigenous peoples. And that produces very different kind of results. So it's hugely biased. And I know that it is, having experienced it before. I didn't know that till I had to do it. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And people were not asking those questions. And in some of the spaces that I'm in, like, people get really offended when I say that, because they thought they had all the answers to this, people involved in this research. The other part of it that I didn't include here is the huge bias to the natural sciences. So there was another article in Carbon Brief that said, I think they did a study. No, it wasn't in Carbon Brief. It was another article, but I cite it in some of the stuff I write. And it was, they looked over the last 50 years, climate change funding, who was getting it. And it's biased towards natural scientists by 780%. So very particular people are deciding what this is. And then you're trying to assess risk and vulnerability. So there wasn't a lot in the social sciences and humanities. So it's a hugely biased literature that people are relying on to do these assessments. And women aren't included as part of that, people of color, Indigenous people. And it's very, Europe actually surprisingly more so than the United States in terms of people who are cited and considered to be the top climate change scientists, as opposed to social scientists and other people and other ways that people might convey knowledge through humanities and arts and other forms. So to me, that was really eye-opening. And because of my own experience there, I'm like, no wonder we can't come up with the solutions, because we're relying on incomplete knowledge and information. They explained a lot. So the problem, Indigenous people are excluded from these processes, lack of recognition of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, even basic human rights, and we're relegated as stakeholders. Even though, as I said before, we're complete societies, and UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognizes self-determination, and these are very hard to insert into the conversations. Climate crisis. Executive Director Ariel of the Indigenous Climate Action. I don't know where she gets all her energy, but glad she's got it. there needs to be a gazillion more Ariels. And again, like, I call these other C words, right? Capitalism and colonialism. You can't say capitalism in these circles. People get really uptight about that. Because I remember being in one, and in this one, literally it was a circle. We're sitting around the table, and we're all divided up into groups. And this one person said, the solution to climate change is electric cars. It's like, okay. I said, well, that doesn't really work in Pewanik, which is a flying community in Northern Ontario, up by it's in the Arctic, like, basically, like, that doesn't work there. Like, they had no idea. In fact, and partly, where do you think electricity comes from, and whose lands are impacted by that? Like, they couldn't peel back the layers to reveal sort of like the inequities and the injustice in which they felt was the solution to everything. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's not gonna affect people in the same way, and the impacts of getting there aren't going to affect people in the same way. So, but I do find, like, there's I call them the other C words that people don't want to hear about. They struggle with it. And even when I've been in these workshops and said this, my comments don't show up in the reports, and there's my name saying I was at the workshop. I'm starting to get pickier about this, because I don't want, because it sounds like I'm okay with what they said, when actually I wasn't. I was actually quite critical, and what I did say doesn't show up there because people they're not there yet. They're not comfortable, and they don't necessarily see the linkages. So again, from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, EPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. And what this often, again, means, when you're not included in that decision-making, a legitimate climate action is direct action. Like, that's, from an Indigenous point of view, that's what you do when you're not included in these kind of processes. That's our climate solutions, right? And so from our point of view, it makes perfect logical sense. But other people, that's not how they see it, because there's the box for Indigenous activism, right? And it's kind of, you have to stay in that kind of box, and it doesn't intersect that much with policy and climate solutions. So there's still a lot of these, again, those kind of silos and those predetermined categories of trying to understand the world can be problematic. And a lot of this, even the solutions can violate Indigenous and human rights because there's a lack of recognition when you peel back the layers of inequality and justice. So what am I trying to do about this when I'm in these frustrating spaces? And the only reason I'm there, really, because there aren't usually other Indigenous people there, is because I work in a university. So that academic knowledge is valued. They're not asking my mom, who speaks the language, who knows more about the land than I do, because I'm in an academic world where I sit in a chair a lot and in front of a computer. That's not who they're asking to be part of these spaces. So there's that huge bias, and I do feel like I need to recognize that, because there's people who are way more knowledgeable about the land and language than I am, and they're not part of these processes. So I've become really interested because of these huge gaps. What is Indigenous climate knowledge? And a lot of it is tied to the land, understanding of our relationships to the nature, earth creation, however we want to construct that. A lot of my work is related to Indigenous knowledges and how can they be part of these processes in a respectful way, as opposed to the sort of extractive way that's sort of conveyed what that research has looked like for decades. What are our own laws? If these other laws are failing, what do our laws say about what we can do about the situation that we're facing? Again, Indigenous peoples experience climate change holistically. You're not experiencing it in the siloed approach. The way the climate change world works is you have, there's monitoring, and then we do the risk and assessment, or risk and vulnerability, and then you do mitigation, and then you do adaptation, and then you do resilience. But that's not how people experience it. Being on the land, you're doing all of those things. When you're on the land and you're hunting, or people are assessing all the time, like they're assessing, is it safe to go on the ice? And they're monitoring. So they're doing all of that in the way of life. It's not siloed, but people study in a very siloed way. So when you find reports are very siloed, and none of them, it's a tiny bit of growing literature, is how do Indigenous peoples then govern the climate changes that are happening? So again, because we spend so much energy dealing with other people's governance of it and their solutions, and we do need to be part of that. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but how do Indigenous people do it? Because I just had to do this the best I could in terms of a literature review. It helps of students, because I'm involved in the Indigenous climate, what we're calling Indigenous Climate Resilience Report, as part of the Natural Resources series on climate change. So they just released a health report. I could hardly find anything on that. What is it that Indigenous peoples are doing? Because again, that's not really supported. It's not really highlighted, because we're not supposed to have the solutions. We just participate in other people's solutions because we experience this in different ways. And when you look at the literature, it's very siloed, and you're just starting to see that governance literature come out. And again, it points to Indigenous peoples who have that close connection to the land and language and family connections do better when there's a major thing like forest fires or flooding. You're able to weather those because you're going to get support from other places that often aren't recognized in the literature. And how the role of Indigenous knowledge in Western science in this, because Indigenous peoples want science too. Often, as soon as you talk about Indigenous knowledge, this happened to me when I was doing my PhD in forestry, science-based department, they go, oh, you must reject science. And I go, well, this is a bizarre place to decide to do my PhD, to reject science, like you're a science-based department. So the people have these ideas that you're always contending with before you even get to have the dialogue and the conversation. So I'm really interested in what Indigenous climate knowledge looks like.
Just the 10-minute mark. Wanted to give you a
okay.
bit of a
I
heads
must
up.
be ignoring the chat. Usually it shows up on the screen, but maybe with PowerPoint it doesn't. So for us, that's a lot of our traditional activities, because they're holistic. You're doing all of those things. And soon, this is like a bias, we'll be opening Sugar Bush this weekend in my community. So we're doing all of those things, because climate really impacts this. We're resilient through on the land activities. That's where resilience, other people's solutions. I didn't talk about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report in 1996, basically said other people's solutions for solving the Indigenous problem has failed since colonial times. Our solutions aren't going to come from there. our well-being comes from being on the land. We have to decolonize the climate change dialogue. Again, people don't like that because if you say decolonize, it must mean there's colonization. And, you know, I find especially the hardcore scientists for 4 decades really struggle with that. This is just some highlights from a workshop that I facilitated with youth and elders on climate change. And they were very focused on the future, like what's the kind of future that we want, based on everything that we know from everything that we've kind of faced in relation to genocide and colonialism and injustice. What I love about this and what I wanted to show it to you is love comes up. I've never heard that come up in non-Indigenous context, but it always comes up in Indigenous context. We love the earth and future generations. That's central to how we see our future and envision our future in climate change circles or conversations. Again, some of the insights, people pointing to industry, capitalism, those being a huge problem in terms of people's ability to be able to adapt and be resilient and see their future. The importance of Indigenous knowledge and language in securing the strong identity and on the land kind of activities was raised by both youth and elders. Again, this is just a quote that one of the picked up again. Again, our laws are central to this. What do our laws say about this? And we know that the current climate change governance policy legal framework is failing miserably. And so what do we have that we can offer these conversations? What do our own laws say? On our own self-determined solutions, what do they look like? They're probably going to be helpful to other people too. That's the idea. And very much tied to our land, language, and identity. So some of the key messages is the importance of land and land-based activities in the work that we do. That helps with adaptation, even in an urban context where most Indigenous peoples are. And this is like the source of climate knowledge for us. And that's not, it's very hard to find that in the peer-reviewed literature to then be reflected in assessments. Promote climate solutions that account for actual Indigenous people's lived experience in a holistic way, not in that very, very siloed way, which is really firmly entrenched. It's like, that's not going to go away anytime soon. Recognition of Indigenous governance as part of climate change solutions, like respect and support for that, these self-determined solutions. Recognize, justice and injustice in proposed solutions, like what does that mean? And recognition of climate change as a continuation of colonialism. Another attitude that I found in a lot of these circles I find myself in is, there's probably a better word for it, but I just call it the 1970s sort of development kind of attitude, which is when there's resistance to government solutions, that are based on inadequate knowledge, is that if only we could get those primitive, undeveloped people up to speed, they would just be totally on board with our solutions. That attitude is so prevalent, and disturbingly so. Like it's quite stunning, and actually kind of makes me sick to my stomach every time I hear it. I'm in these spaces. I'm like, why am I here? That I have to listen to this, because there isn't that kind of self-examination back to see where the gaps might be in the knowledge that a lot of these folks might have in terms of their climate knowledge. In my view, climate knowledge already exists in Indigenous communities, but no one's really asked about it. It really hasn't been mobilized out. Even though Indigenous people are telling these stories, people don't know that's what's happening, because they only, unless it's peer reviewed, and some of the good stuff may not get published if people disagree, because there's a lot of gatekeeping in this world. We don't have all the knowledge that we need to come up with the solutions to face our challenges. Our climate futures. This is my niece. She's now 3. She was 2 there, so she'll be in the bush probably this weekend. So we ask ourselves different questions. Do we love future generations? Will our work benefit future generations? And what kind of ancestor are we going to be? My ancestors made sure I would be here. So what am I going to do to make sure that my descendants are going to have a future as well? So our climate change questions are a little bit different than other people's questions. So Yeah, so this is it. This is just the youth that were at the youth elders gathering that I facilitated, and miigwech for that. And I will stop share. So hopefully this kind of made sense. I'm trying to draw in like all these experiences that I've had into some kind of coherent narrative that hopefully made sense to you.
I think it definitely did. And I loved hearing this perspective. It was new for me and I found it really fascinating and really helpful. So thank you so much for that. We will open it up to the Q&A and to the attendees. I see a few questions in the Q&A, but again, you're welcome to raise your hand and I can always unmute you and you can ask your questions out loud. But I will start with some of the questions we have here and I'll read them out. So the first one is, how do you bridge the laws, governance systems, and knowledge systems of diverse Indigenous societies when it comes to the climate justice work of Assembly of First Nations?
That's a good question. You have to recognize the diversity of them. Like, first of all, there's people from all over, like Northwest Territories and Southern Ontario. And so that's probably one of the first things that needs to be acknowledged. Same with even the climate assessment. Like we had to go beyond, because the federal government's really into what they call the distinctions-based, Inuit, First Nations, Métis. It's like actually even within there, it's very diverse. And partly it was a struggle, not because we didn't recognize that, because people aren't generally a lot of their climate knowledge isn't in public realm per se. So that's sort of how we recognize that. And we do meet and we do have gatherings where we will come to an agreement. Like, so you'll find on the AFN website, the elders statement on climate change. So they met, they agreed on this. It can take a while, maybe not, the way that federal government wants it done. They're still working on an Indigenous knowledge framework. That's taken years because you're trying to get consensus around what are those common elements that matter to folks. The other thing that the AFN does is it goes to their, they have annual assemblies twice a year, and everything goes to that assembly and people they see it and they have to approve, and they also can make changes to it. So whatever the diversity is across the country are there. So they call it bringing it to chiefs and assembly, has to be approved by resolution. And if people say yes, but you have to do this, this, and this, then that's done. So there's processes built into their governance framework that it goes back to that wide variety of people, even though I'm working with this group that's representative geographically and as much culturally of Indigenous peoples. Surprisingly, there are a lot of commonalities. What's interesting about where there isn't, I guess I'll say it, is the influence of Christianity. That's actually where it can change dramatically when people are talking about, like, let's say their traditional framework for what I'll just call assessment. Other people who are more, let's say Christian in orientation, they recognize that, but they may struggle with it because of that experience of colonization. Like they'll just say that's great, but that would never work in my community because people are really very Christian, right? So that's come up. So surprisingly, that tends to be, I hear that more than that's not how we do things where I'm from. Like it's more that, and again, that influence of colonization. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for that answer. Another question we have is, have you noticed any shifts over time in terms of the inclusion of Indigenous voices and including acknowledgement of the role of colonialism in perpetuating climate change in global climate change summits and negotiations?
No, not really. What you do see, like, so in the Climate Science 250 report, they speak to Indigenous leadership, Indigenous-led research, Indigenous-led science. Nobody knows what that looks like. So that's still yet to be figured out. Like, how do you actually realize this? The Healthy Environment, Healthy Climate again speaks to Indigenous. They'll speak to Indigenous knowledge, but not really to that colonialism per se. Because what that means is you're going to have to address it. It means that funding isn't just for everyone should have an electric car. It actually has to be, how are you going to undo some of this damage? so that people recover language, people, and so just, as an aside, where I'm finding out what a national kind of policy framework. So the federal government through the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada has developed a national federal Indigenous knowledge policy framework. So this has been advocated for by Indigenous peoples for decades. This may not be exactly what we had in mind, and it's for federal officials. And so when I'm part of a project that's reviewing that, like, does it actually kind of represent people's interests? And the first thing they noticed was it doesn't acknowledge colonialism. Because when you don't, so we're advocating for that in the preamble, because you have to, because they want this knowledge from Indigenous people, but it's been disrupted through genocide and colonialism, like residential schools. I don't know my language because of this history, right? And I'm not able to pass it on to my kids, so it's intergenerational. So when you're talking about capacity building to get this knowledge from Indigenous people, you need to support those revitalization efforts. So it takes them into a whole other realm that I think they don't want to necessarily go to. Indigenous peoples recognize it. So I know at COP in Scotland, people did, like, that's a lot of the advocacy. So they'll talk about it, but I don't really see it in the policy frameworks, because I think, like, I don't think they know how to define decolonization, because that's kind of what you'd have to do, right? Like, this is a call for decolonized climate change funding. Like, I don't know when that's gonna happen. And I sit on a committee that looks at, I think it's climate monitoring. My term is going to be coming up, so we're looking at proposals that come in. It's very biased, they will talk about, hey, there needs to be land-based stuff. Native people said it's important, but they don't know why. And there needs to be these intergenerational camps and things like that, but they don't exactly know why. But it's trying to recover, like, it's trying to decolonize and trying to build that climate, like that knowledge base to broader than the few people who have that knowledge and live on the land and everything else, right? So it has huge implications for them. So that's what we're advocating for. Like, why are you not recognizing that? Because that has huge implications for what you want. Because what we have to deal with as Indigenous people is, but if you don't conform, like, oh, like, you must have Indigenous knowledge, and without any understanding that what people went through, could have been 60s scoop, could have been, yeah, that people don't. And I've been in because I work in the Indigenous knowledge area, as well as, people have been, people don't have that knowledge anymore. That's just romanticized, hocus pocus kind of stuff. Like, literally, people have said that to my face, and I'm like, do you not know why someone may not know? Like, do you not do you not know this history? So I think, so it hasn't. Indigenous people continue to advocate for that. Like, it's part of our report. So I'm actually, it's part of, it should be mentioned, because I did mention it in the piece that I wrote. So in the changing the health report that just came out about a month ago, it'll be in the chapter I wrote, because I included it in there, and the lead authors accepted it, and it got through the peer review for that. So it's there. And I believe the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health also did a chapter, and they talked about colonialism, because we're talking about food security and how that impacts. So it's starting to show up there, and that's because they had Indigenous authors. So that made a difference, and in terms of our contribution to these, in terms of naming it. But that's just the assessment. That's not how do people then take to SAP and then propose solutions, right? So that is where I'm seeing it, and you're starting to see the inroads. If you can get in there rather than being not in there, being part of the assessments and such, then you're on the outside looking in, doing advocacy, and maybe people hear what you have to say and maybe they don't. I'm hoping that another IPCC report comes out. Again, this was 3 weeks, literally 3 weeks this summer, ruined my summer, finished a grant writing, and then 3 weeks we were given 2 pages to do climate change impacts on Indigenous peoples in Mexico, North America, and Canada, led by Kyle White. And so there we talk about colonialism. So hopefully that shows up in that IPCC report, but it'll be like 2 pages, but 40 pages of references, because we really wanted to kind of make that point, but also say that, you need to support the Indigenous climate governance. And that's why I was looking at that literature, because we were trying to find it, because we had to go to the peer-reviewed literature and go, where can we find this? And there wasn't a lot. And I continued to scan for that, because I'm like, there really needs to be more here in terms of that, work. So it should be showing up, and again, led by Indigenous authors. but it's hard to find like proof in the peer-reviewed literature to be able to support that. So it should be in the health, because I know I wrote it in there, and I also wrote it in the section, the 400 words I had for the. I haven't been able to find it because like a 500-page report. I can't even see where my contribution is, but I did write it in there. So at least it's mentioned there, maybe once or twice in 400 words in that most recent IPCC report that came out on risk and vulnerability. So yes, so very tiny, but it's there. So maybe it'll, kind of expand a little bit.
That's good. I hope so too. And we can share that when we follow up with the recording of this webinar. We can share that report in that email so everyone has
If someone
that.
can find it, let me know. I haven't
Yeah, we'll another question we have is, you mentioned research involving gender. What kind of gender differences do you notice in terms of the impacts of climate change on Indigenous communities?
The knowledge is gendered. So there's a really cool book that you can actually download from Athabasca University on women's knowledge of the land. And so the gender bias is like insane, because part of Canada's recognition of Aboriginal rights and treaty rights comes from land use occupancy studies. And what they found is that there's a huge bias because people talk to men and they didn't talk to women. And I was talking to a fella for some, I was being interviewed as part of National Women's Association of Canada, and he worked on the Inuit land use and occupancy study that created Nunavut. He goes, "You're like, we talked about this." He goes, "Yeah, there was over 70 elders. He was part of that we talked to, and only 4 were women." So it's hugely biased to things that men do. Even any of the Aboriginal court cases that come through, it's usually men. So it's hugely biased towards what men do, not what women do. But knowledge is gendered. So in my area of water justice, women have the responsibility to speak for water. So that may not be true across Canada, but in the Anishinaabe tradition, that's the case. So knowledge, so you have responsibilities because you can't know everything. So knowledge is also gendered. Women are also impacted differently when crisis or something happens, because you're often the caregiver. So you're trying to get out of places, and you're trying to get either small children out, or you're taking care of the elderly who may not be all that mobile. So even in those kind of situations, women are impacted differently. And what they find in other climate change research, disaster research, is, and so they found this with the Fort McMurray fires, is increase in domestic violence. Because the other thing that happens is the support that you could get, well, let's say with Hurricane Katrina, it's gone, or even there's no shelters, they're gone. So you can't get the support that you also need, because in times of crisis, for some bizarre reason, well, actually a lot of people theorize around this, there's increase in violence towards women. So women have these, so you're trying to get out of a community, fly-in community, and you've got kids and you've got elders that you're trying to, so women have these other different kind of responsibilities as part of family or community life that put these other kind of additional responsibilities on women. But knowledge is gendered. There's a lot that's shared, but there's a lot that's also gendered. And you're already dealing with kind of this huge bias. Like you're already dealing with this, with this bias. And some of the work that the Native Women's Association of Canada is dealing with, like when we're inputting into these broader policy processes, they're making sure that they're doing their own framework through their gender-based analysis, which is finally recognized federally. It's now part of EA. My opinion is people don't know how to do it. They just know they're supposed to do something, related to gender, but they're not quite sure because they know that, people are impacted differently. So those are ones that I've heard. Probably the only climate assessment that's kind of public, if you're really interested, you want to find it, is the Native Women's Association of Quebec did one, and they talk about the unique impacts. I refer to it a lot because first, the other thing is Indigenous peoples haven't been funded to do their own climate assessments, and they focused on the impact in relation to gender. And you can find that, like, it's publicly available. It's not in the peer-reviewed literature, so it's hard to cite for these. I did anyway, because I'm like, well, we haven't been able to do our own assessments, or if people have done them, they're not public, they're not publicly available to be able to access. So they do a good job of doing that. Hopefully that's helpful. I'm just pointing you to folks who know more about that than I do.
That's very helpful, and we can include that in the email as well for everyone. We have a question here from Seta. She asks, can we say that the last events related to energy resources will cause more harms to Indigenous peoples? Can we say that future has more problems for these groups, specifically talking, for example, about the Uyghurs in China? Are they in danger because of the variety of very rich natural reserves?
I don't know much about specifically those situations, so I can't comment. But if it were in a Canadian context, yeah, for sure. Like that's, yes, yesterday, Monday, we just saw the screening of a colleague of mine, Angela Luke, who lives in the Treaty 8 area where the tar sands are, a documentary of the experiences there. Like literally it's genocidal in their case, not being able to have clean water and land, because literally they can drain lakes by taking the groundwater. So so based on that experience, not knowing their particular context, I would agree there's going to be enormous impact, especially, you know, Canada's not perfect, especially where you know there's a history of human rights violations, basic human rights. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And our final question here today, in your research, what kind of Indigenous-driven solutions have you found for the meaningful inclusion of Indigenous voices and knowledges in climate governance?
I think for me is finally making those teeny little inroads in terms of the assessments. And to me, like, actually, I wish I could pull it up and look at it, is where people are taking the leadership, and they're not waiting for the funding to come from the governments. Like they're developing their own kind of solutions. So let's say Indigenous Climate Action saying, you know, we're going to develop our own. They were one of the examples that I used in the governance section I wrote for this report. They're going to develop their own policy framework and teach Indigenous peoples to develop their own policy frameworks rather than trying to jam yourself into other people's. You can still do that because people will support you to do that, but not kind of develop your own. They've developed a climate toolkit for youth, and where they're delivering the training on that. So to me, those are going to lead to those kind of, you know, valuing community knowledge and experience, not having to rely on, because that's already out there. Like if you want to know the peer-reviewed literature, it's out there. Like that's what people use, but we don't have the community knowledge and experiences. So they're starting to do that. So they're doing really important work. Inuit Tapirsit Katami, they have a national climate change strategy, the only one of the national organizations that does. So they're starting to say, this is what we understand the problem, this is the kind of support that we need to be able to deal with. So to me, I see those as, I wish I could say there were more examples. Literally, I had 2 students over the summer, find me some, and that are public domain, you know, that I can refer to and you can find. I'm told that there's others, but they're not public per se. Like people say, well, this community has one, but they're not public. You can't, like, it's hard to find them. So I see, so you have to have an expanded notion about what that is. It'll be interesting to see how that goes, because that report will be peer reviewed. We'll see whether people think my idea of what the answer to your question is what, you know, Indigenous climate solutions would point to. The Guardians programs, like those, the Guardians programs are teaching youth and others in communities to be guardians of the land and waters. Like that's like, those are our climate solutions, right? So those are what we talk about in those. Also developing our own kind of assessment framework. So someone like Deanna Lewis, who's contributing to this, she looks at, she developed like a culture-based environmental assessment framework. Social determinants of health is more than social determinants, also political. So you're accounting for that colonialism as well. So you're starting to see this kind of innovation and emerging where people like me who are scholars are getting to engage with community people and start to figure out like these new kind of models and these new kind of processes. You know, I'm hoping to work on one with a project over the summer with a colleague on what does Indigenous One Health look like, right? Instead of just trying to stick Indigenous into the existing one, what does an Indigenous concept look like? Because in my mind, it already exists. We just haven't mobilized it into that kind of vocabulary or into that kind of realm. So that's what I was saying, are those, we'll see how that goes with when it goes to peer review. But those were that's how, and it looks different, like community-based solar energy, like community, like those kind of community initiatives where they're not waiting for someone else's big solution. They're going ahead with what they think they need to do. Land camps for kids to learn language and culture. Those are our like approaches to that. So I guess we'll see when that report becomes available, whether that, like, even like we are hopefully going to get to say who our peer reviewers are, who will hopefully get it and not say that's not like policy and that's not going to count. Like they'll accept what it is that communities are already doing. That's what an assessment is doing. Like it's already kind of existing and you're kind of pulling it together. They don't do new original research. You're just working with what already exists. So that's what I was doing, and that's what I was looking for, and that was hard to find actually. Yeah, I haven't done an assessment since probably did a scan since August, so maybe there's new things now, but that's kind of as of August of last year, that's what we found.
Well, Professor McGregor, thank you so much for this really insightful presentation, and thank you for all of our participants as well for joining and for your questions. Before we sign off, if you missed any of today's session, we are recording it and it will be available on our website in a few days. So you're welcome to go back and we will try to share all the resources mentioned, but if you missed any of those, you can go back and listen. And I just also want to remind you to register for our upcoming webinars. So we have one next week, Tuesday, March 15th at 3 p.m. with David Estrin. He'll be presenting on the role of human rights law, domestic courts, and citizen suits in limiting dangerous climate change. So we hope to see you there. Again, thank you so much, Professor McGregor, and stay safe, everyone. Be well.
Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.